Incredibly strange, beautifully crafted, and weirdly quite addictive. It's the Super Pad by Mr. Will Iron Soup. And this is not a pad that you can actually buy yet, it's still a kind of prototype. It has functions of a gamepad, but also functions of an arcade stick. And that's what makes it so interesting. But the question is, instead of an analog stick, is this clicky lever that you would get on something like an arcade stick, is it really better? Let's find out. Full disclaimer, this product was sent to me for the purposes of making this video. Now, there's a lot to say about this controller, but I'm going to jump straight to the point. You should be interested because of this weird arcade stick, which is kind of like an analog stick. It's small, like a pad, and yes, you can hold it handheld like this, but in general, it's expected that you'll have it on your lap because of this 6-button layout, which is easier to use if you've got your hand over. But in addition to being like a fight pad, it's also like a tinkerer's dream because it's got so many different switches on here. You've got the clicky analog stick, of course, but you've also got a clicky D-pad. It's modular, so you can actually swap in a second D-pad, and it's also modular on the right side, so you can swap in a completely different set of action buttons that are clicky, or you can go for these ones which are just using standard key switches, and they're all Cherry MX apart from these switches on top, which are also a combination of Cherry MX switches and Choc V2 low profile switches. So let's discuss things in order, starting with design. It looks like a keepsake jewelry box, which is really bizarre, but you can hold it in your hands, and it has been designed so that you can hold it comfortably in your hands, but as you can see, it is not ergonomic at all. It doesn't really need to be that ergonomic because you're just going to be resting it on your leg and playing it like this. In terms of design, I think it's absolutely fascinating. This is definitely the sort of thing that a collector would absolutely love. The way that the buttons come off this thing, you know, like in Transformers, they actually had like an entire city and the city itself could transform. It actually kind of looks like this, but just check out the finish going all the way around the controller. It's got this reflective purple look to it on one side, but it's got a sort of reflective orange look on the other side, and on the front, it's got these crazy insignias that you might see more commonly on something like a custom-made guitar. And then you flip it over to the back and it's got this double-layered base, which has the name of the controller itself, the Super Pad, and also it's been customized, so it actually says NihongoGamer Edition. Especially nice if you're trying to buy something as a gift for someone. Little selector switches, again, like something you might find on something like a Jazzmaster guitar. He's just chosen some really cool hardware. But with this really cool design do come some downsides, and the main one is that it's just not ergonomic. And even though it does have this angle here on the sides so that you can fit your palm on it, the way I found that my hands fit onto it, it just causes the whole controller to tilt a little bit like this, like 20 degrees this way to the right, and as a result, every time I was trying to press forward, I would end up pressing upright instead. Now, with regards to the modular aspect of this controller, and there are not that many pads out there that can say that they are modular, you can take the D-pad out and swap it for the other one, and you can take the 5-pad module out and replace it for the clicky version, but again, since this is a prototype and it uses quite cheap screws, or maybe it's just that the plastic is a little bit too soft. I think I've stripped the insides of these. I'm not even sure if I can take them out again. So when you disassemble it, you may not be able to reassemble it again. So it's kind of scary. It's been well thought out though, and I like the large USB-B style port because it's just a nice chunky connector. But obviously a natural thing to put in a new version of this would be USB-C instead. The next thing I want to talk about is the most interesting thing on this controller, and it's this, the analog stick, which is not analog, it's more of an arcade stick. But again, it's not really an arcade stick, it's more of a D-pad. The reason it's so interesting is that if you actually look inside here, you can see that it's actually constructed of 4 micro switches, a lot like what you'd find on a standard JLS. So where on a normal D-pad, you would actually push down on buttons and they would push up and down on a key switch. A lever on a normal arcade stick, and what's being done here is actually causing the switches to be actuated by tilting the lever down, up, left, or right. And the reason I thought that was so cool when I first received this was that unlike an analog stick where you always have to use lateral movement of your thumb to go up, down, left, and right, you can actually push down in order to get certain directions. So it really is like the best of both worlds between a D-pad and an arcade stick lever. Because of course, if you actually had a teeny tiny arcade stick and you only were able to tilt the stick, it would just be really difficult because lateral movement on your thumb, it's really difficult to do repeated down motions or repeated forward motions, which you do all the time, especially in anime games where you're dashing or you need to do fast falls or anything like that. So I was really excited about this arcade stick, but in practice, I feel like it does still need some work. There's something about the plastic that was used for the lever of this arcade stick, which kind of grates every time you push up. It's difficult to hear. These switches don't have a round shape. They're kind of like cylinders. And of course, the cylinder shape actually just kind of grates up against the plastic as opposed to being round and friction-free. Even though it's cool, you can push down on it a bit like a D-pad. It's just so much extra work compared to what you would do with just a normal D-pad. And especially with games like Street Fighter 6 being like the main game that everyone's playing right now, you need to be fast and able to react to anything, and anything that gets in your way, like friction or just unintuitive design, that's just going to make your life much harder. Another thing that needs to change if you're going to use a teeny tiny arcade stick is that the lever's length is much shorter. If you have a much shorter lever, you also have less leverage. And so it is actually just straight up. It requires more force to move this thing up, down, left, and right compared to an arcade lever, which is like 2 or 3 inches long, and obviously you have a great deal more force when you push from that distance away from the pivot. Now the shape of this arcade stick is actually kind of interesting. It's gone for the straight 3D printed shape, but it is concave, and as a result it means that you can kind of skate your finger around the edges in order to do circular motions. The thing is, because it's still 3D printed plastic, you will eventually end up with blisters and cuts on your fingers because you're running your finger along hard, rounded 3D printed plastic. I don't recommend it. Honestly though, there is so much promise here because the idea of a little arcade stick that you can tilt a lot like an arcade stick, but also push down on like a D-pad, that's not something you can do with a standard analog stick. And so I really hope that he continues to refine the design of this thing into something that no other pad and no other controller has. Now, the reason you would buy a pad like this is because of the 8-way thumbstick, but in case you also wanted to use a D-pad for very specific characters or specific maneuvers, you also do get this option, the Plus style D-pad, which is like the Nintendo controller, or the PlayStation style split D-pad. Now, I preferred this one. It's really cheap feeling. It's kind of probably an off-the-shelf part. It's got clicky switches underneath it, and it felt okay to use, but again, because it feels like an off-the-shelf part, like this kind of grates up against my fingers and it caused my fingers to hurt. I preferred this Nintendo style D-pad to the PlayStation one. Whatever switches he's put in here, they are so much work to press. They are really heavy. But like I said, the main reason you would get a controller like this is for the 8-way thumbstick. Talking about the buttons on this controller, you do have 2 options of modules, and the one that I had originally on here was the clicky buttons. Again, these are really, really heavy switches, and pressing any of these 2 buttons at the same time to do like an EX move was near impossible for me. It's just really difficult to get clicky switches to go down at exactly the same time, which is why I much prefer this module, which is not clicky. These are just standard Cya MX, I believe they're Cya MX brown switches. I also don't really like the decision to go with tactile bump switches, but that is something that you could change yourself because, again, they're just standard Cya MX switches. Where it really starts to get interesting is the shoulder buttons. Now, these shoulder buttons are not laid out top and bottom a bit like a PlayStation controller. They're more like a new Nintendo 3DS when they had the R, L, ZR, and ZL buttons. They were actually laid out side by side like this. Not only does it work really well, it also allows you to do some cool stuff that you couldn't do on another controller. You can actually press both buttons at the same time by doing this. Now, it just so happens that the way that this controller is laid out is that these are not actually L buttons. In fact, the L buttons are here on the right because the R buttons are here on the front of the pad. I don't think it has any built-in way to rewire the controller so that these are L1 and L2. Currently, they're hardwired to options and share, but that is a feature that presumably would be added if this goes into production. I love the idea that every button has like a feel and a position to it. So it's like, it's either a low profile switch, or it's a high, standard Cya MX switch, but with this extra high profile thing, which gives it all this extra height. Aluminium on wood is always going to look cool. Listen, that's all we got time for with this super pad. It is, of course, a prototype, but I absolutely believe that one day this could be a production model. Not just because the design is cool, or the design language, or the use of really bizarre buttons that you can, just like completely different set of shapes and buttons and caps. But really, I think the star of the show is this interesting arcade stick that Iron Soup has been working on. If he can continue to optimize this arcade stick so it becomes basically an analog stick that you can also push down on like a D-pad, there's definitely a winning design in here. It's just getting everything else to match up. But if you are interested in this sort of controller, you can actually build it yourself. I believe the designs are still free to download on a website called Thingiverse. And the reason is that the creator of this controller is not 100% sure if he even could make these things at a profit. If he considered like actual mass production and changing various aspects of the controller so it could be mass produced, I'm sure he could drive that cost down below, and I believe it would totally be worth it if he were able to optimize the design of this thumbstick. Anyway, that's all I've got time for. If you are interested, I'll put some extra details in the description box below. Thank you very much, Will, from Iron Soup. I really appreciate you sending this controller over. It's a really great vision. Really excited about the future. Anyway, if you guys want to see more videos like this, make sure that you're subscribed. Comment below what's the coolest looking controller, especially a custom controller that you've ever seen. I'd love to know about it. Maybe one day I can even make a video about it. Like the video if you haven't done so already. That's all for now. I'll see you real soon.